there's a huge wake-up call coming. I mean, we're all watching Starbucks unionizing, we're watching Amazon unionizing, Apple starting to unionize. I feel like there's a huge wake-up call to sort of the ruling class, the oligarchs of America, if you will, because workers are uniting and recognizing that people have the power. And I do think letting go of the power and the hierarchy and the sort of trickle up to the top financial model, I'm hoping is going to start to have some challenges over the next few years.
The Grow Dialogue podcast is a liberation project that explores equity, inclusion, belonging, conflict resolution, and culture in the workplace and beyond, including in our personal relationships, families, and communities. Each week, my co-host, Mariella Marie, and I will bring you insightful guest interviews and artistic expressions curated to amplify emerging voices who are sharing practices that support society's transition to a more collaborative, just, sustainable, and liberating coexistence. We live during a time when divisiveness and polarization dominate the social, economic, and political discourse. In response to this reality, and empowered with the skills of authentic dialogue and systems thinking, I created an anti-oppression framework for social sustainability called Theory of Indivisibility to help illuminate a different path forward. Our hope is that these conversations and calls to action will ignite tolerance and empathy and provide guidance for our global listeners who want to actively engage in ending all forms of oppression while creating thriving relationships in the workplace and beyond. I'm Dr. Sundiata Soon-Jahta. Let's grow dialogue. Hey, Merce, how you doing?
Hey, Sundiata. Good. So good to be with you.
Thank you for being here with me. Thank you for agreeing to carve out some time to share a little bit about you and your journey through corporate and a little bit about your personal life as well with the Grow Dialogue listeners.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I want to start out by asking you, to start about on the personal side, so how would you describe yourself personally? If I said to you, who are you personally? How would you describe that?
Such an evolving question. Who am I? I would say I am a retired, but I don't like that word. There have been some other better words for retired, but a second phase of my life, 58-year-old gay, fat, white woman who is committed to self-direction in schooling and for adults, liberation, anti-racism, and really trying to find a way but to contribute to the effort to have the human experience feel really good for all the humans, which, I think we're really far from that end goal at the moment, but that's how I would describe my life at the moment. I'm also about to be an empty nester. I have an 18-year-old son who's headed off to college, surprisingly enough. I didn't think that was going to happen, but he decided he wants to go and he's going.
Awesome. That was such a rich description. I appreciate how you went a little further in terms of pulling out certain descriptors than I've noticed a lot of people will do. I think that there's, it actually gets into some of the things I want to ask later. So maybe I'll just use that as a teaser and we'll come back to go a little bit deeper. But I appreciate that description and the details you just shared about yourself. And so the next question I have for you is, who are you professionally? How would you define yourself as a professional?
Such a good question. For 21 years, I was in corporate and was a co-founder and an executive and, had a whole bunch of people by the end. I mean, it started out with 5 of us, and by the end, I think I had about 1,100 people reporting up to me. And in that environment, I was really focused on and trying to create a culture that was nurturing instead of just, pure corporate burnout kind of an environment. and was really committed to communication, relationship building. I wouldn't say equity, because I don't think I had the distinctions of what equity could really look like. But I really wanted it to feel good to people. Since then, I've been doing a few different things. I've been participating a bunch with the Agile Learning Center community, which, as you know, Soon-Jahta is self-directed education school model that my son went to from middle of second grade to graduating, and these Agile Learning Centers have popped up all over the world. So I support that in a number of different ways. I'm on the board, and I support any given school when they are asking for it. And I've been putting together groups of people to practice community collaboration, equity. As you know, I had a call at the beginning of the pandemic that was supposed to be one call about visualizing the future. Yeah. And invited 50 people to that call, 25 Black folks, 25 white folks. About 35 people showed up to that first call. And then we just kept meeting for almost a year, every Saturday. I think we were all just, isolating and in our homes, and really wanted that connection. And so many connections and seeds have spawned from that group. I did some corporate consulting. I'm finding myself not as interested in being in corporate spaces unless it's truly about sort of turning the model upside down and sort of experimenting with structures other than hierarchical and power over. So I do some corporate stuff, and I'm happy to do corporate stuff, especially if it's amplifying or supporting Black-owned businesses. And then I have this sort of retreat center deschooling idea that is starting to come more and more to life, where people could come for a weekend, a week, a month, and use that environment to de-school and deconstruct a lot of the imprinting of traditional schooling and corporate and just, society, and start to tap into intuition, self-direction, who am I really when I'm not trying to perform in all the ways that I've been conditioned to perform. So that's a little bit scattered of a description, but that's kind of where my life is right now. There's just a lot sort of brewing, and nothing that's, kind of, this is what I'm doing every day from 9 to 5.
Yeah, I mean, you're emerging, you're constantly evolving. Yes. And just in that brief description, I mean, you shared a story of evolution that I thought was going to be really interesting for our listeners. And that's why I asked you to be a guest, because you started out on a very conventional track in corporate. Yeah. And to speak to, hear you speak to where you are now in your anti-oppression lens, your equity lens, your inclusion lens, and all those things are so, on par with what people are calling for and asking for, and the changes that, a lot of people within corporate spaces are demanding. And, I appreciate that, you can speak to it, from both contexts, because if you can share a little bit more about your role in corporate. So you were a co-founder, and you had 1,100, that's a lot of people, 1,100 people reporting to you in your role. You were a senior vice president, you were, I believe, senior vice president. And could you share a little bit about the industry that you operated in?
Yeah, definitely. So title was executive vice president. And, it was funny because when it was 5 of us, I was the executive vice president of no one. But by the end, there was all that. And so the industry was originally, it was direct marketing of sort of any subscription-based product. So we, at one point, the New York Times was a client, MasterCard was our client, some insurance companies, wireless was really big when there was a very low percentage of wireless users in this country. We were selling or really giving away free phones, at a rapid rate, hundreds of thousands of phones a month by virtue of direct mail and outbound and inbound call centers. Eventually, we veered toward the insurance industry. And when I left in 2016, it was primarily insurance focused. It was Medicare supplements, life insurance, health insurance, stuff like that. So the 1,100 people were all sales center employees. And one thing I feel good about that whole thing, the whole corporate model of a few folks at the top making a shit ton of money, and all the people whose backs that's on are, in many cases not even making a living wage. And we did pay people, I think, pretty well for that industry. There were people making six figures, people making, just good money. So I feel in hindsight good about that. But at the same time, it was a very traditional corporate model with, investors, people at the top making a shit ton, the people who are really doing the work making a lot less. So yeah, I was trying my best to make it a great place to be. And I think there were some successes in that domain and some ways in which, I would want to do it all very differently if I went back.
I can imagine. What were some of the, markers of success? I know a little bit about your story, but what would you say some of the markers of success that, you were able to accomplish in that role?
Yeah, so our model, our original CEO, Mark Byron, and our CEO until a couple of years ago, Dave Graff, were really into this model of getting investors, increasing the value of the company, selling to a new investment group, and in that sale, there's an increase in valuation. So if you're worth $100 million and then a few years later you're worth $250 million, then the original investors are getting 2.5 times their return, and then the management gets to take a little bit of money off the table, and then you do it all over again. So in the course of our being in a company together, I think our initial seed funding was $1 million. When I left, the last sale that we did was like $525 million. And then a year and a half after I left, it was over $1 billion. So from a, capitalist corporate, success story, that's considered huge success. And then, again, from what I was trying to accomplish, which was making it a great place to work, there are other just human being successes, people who came in who didn't have an insurance license. I remember one woman who was living in her car, didn't have her children with her. We funded her getting her insurance license. She got her insurance license, was a great salesperson, was able to get a house, get her kids back. So there were, cool stories like that kind of, helped me sleep at night, even as I was recognizing that the whole system was not great for everyone. Mm-hmm. So those are a couple of markers from different sides of the equation.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And so, you all were an American success story in terms of all the markers, as traditional markers of success. Yeah. And ultimately, is it fair to say that this endeavor over time made you a wealthy person?
Yeah, I consider myself wealthy. I have a few $1 million. I think maybe less than that. A couple $1 million, I should say. Mm-hmm. I think some people think I'm not wealthy enough to not worry about money, and some people think I have shit tons of money. And it's just such an interesting dynamic to be in. I think a lot of people thought I was, silly to leave when I did, and that I would have, gotten a few more $1 million if I had stayed, because that next sale I would have participated in. So I consider myself to be very wealthy, both financially, spiritually, emotionally. I think some people would agree and some people would disagree.
Okay. Well, the reason I asked that is because, here we are, we find ourselves, in this space where, again, at the very opening, when you talked about who you are and the things that you care about, you care about very heartfelt things. So it tells me and our listeners that the journey wasn't just about money for you.
Yeah.
And even though you were able to accomplish, the success in that way by being a part of the company and one of the founders, et cetera, and taking it to those heights, there was something that happened to you along the way in your journey that it kind of shifted your lens from seeing money in itself and the accumulation of wealth as a marker for success to this equity lens, this inclusion lens, this belonging lens, and wanting to make this place like you said, a great place for people to come and work where they feel valued, et cetera. Can you speak to, or do you know where that shift happened for you?
Yeah, well, I think let me say a few things about it and then we'll see if it makes any sense.
Okay.
I truthfully have never really been money motivated. Money, I do come from multi-generations of wealth. And though my mother was not really grounded in how much privilege and wealth she had. She had times where she'd be saying, well, we can't really afford groceries. And the next day she'd be saying, let's go to Europe and go skiing. And I just realized that she was just did not have a balanced relationship with reality. And I sort of developed this idea about money that I could sort of have money flow anytime, anywhere I wanted. So I'm just not that materialistic. Even though I do have money, I don't, buy fancy clothes or have a fancy car. I'm just not that money and material focused. That said, I ended up in a relationship with the co-parent of my son, Jill. And Jill wanted me to make a bunch of money. She had a job where she was not making a lot of money, and she was like, don't make a lot of money. And I think, just inside that relationship, I was like, all right, I can do that. But it had to be in an environment where I felt like I was making a positive difference. I don't think I ever could have, sort of sat in a Wall Street room and just been manipulating stocks around. I had to feel like there were human beings that I was positively impacting in that, pursuit, if you will. And I was really good at it. Telephone sales, I started doing when I was in college. I went to a telemarketing group. They wanted me to be Susie Sparks. They didn't think Mercer Carlin was a very good telemarketing name. I think I sounded like a porn star or something. But anyway, I've always been really great on the phones. And then teaching people to be able to do that so that they could make their money always felt really, really good to me. Mm-hmm. That said, I'd left my company twice. Once when my son was born, I was supposed to take a 6-month maternity leave. 3 months in, the company was not doing well. And my boss said, listen, you either need to come back to work now, or I need to give you a package and need to go. So I took the package and went. And then 6 months later, they hired me back because the company was doing better. So, and then I left again when Timothy was 3, because I wanted to pursue executive coaching and doing stuff that felt more personal development related than be in this business. But the plan was that my ex would be making all the money and I would, be starting up, building something, and that she didn't end up doing that. So I ended up going back to my company. And I had a coach and a healer type person who I used to talk to on a very regular basis. And I kept saying, can I leave now? She's like, no, you're supporting a child. You need to stay. So I was always somewhat conflicted about the fact that I was in this sort of, just money-making scheme. It's just, corporate America, as most of your listeners are probably aware, is, legally you are bound to be growing the business. So you can't just say, this is great exactly as it is. Let's give way more of our money to our employees. Let's not worry about, profit growth. You can't do that like legally. You're bound to be growing and producing, returns for your investors. So it was always a bit of a conflict for me. But then at some point, I'm trying to think when it really started to be visible how I wanted to live my life. I think when we opened our Charlotte center, sales center, and our employees were probably 60% Black, which was not the case in our Tampa and Fort Myers centers in Florida. And I think that, throughout my life, I had been present to racism and Blackness. Spike Lee's mom was my first grade teacher. She was, very much making sure that we were not living in sort of a purely whitewashed world. So I had influences from early on, to alert me to sort of racist tendencies and whiteness. But I think when I started interacting with all of these amazing Black folks in Charlotte, and then I started following people on Instagram, and I started getting really connected to the idea of white privilege, white power, a lot of distinctions that I just hadn't quite delved into and didn't really understand. Plus my son being in this self-directed education school, the Agile Learning Center, that was really trying to be accessible. Most private schools are, the rich white kids go to the private school and leave the rest behind. And this was a sliding scale. If you could afford it, you paid a bunch. If you couldn't, you didn't. So that was really different for New York City. So a bunch of things were sort of converging to wake me up, if you will. And a really pivotal moment was when I read Adrienne Marie Brown's first book. I don't know if it was her very first, but first one that I knew of, Emergent Strategy. And that book and the way she expressed herself it just turned everything upside down. She had a chapter on charismatic leadership. I had been sort of, I don't know what the right word is, but mentored to be a charismatic leader. I did, landmark education programs when I was 19. I started, being in front of hundreds of people at a time. I was really appreciated for that charismatic leader persona. And so the idea of deconstructing that, and it's not about charismatic leader, and it's not about hierarchy, and it's not about, sage on the stage, it's about guide on the side. That was all so new to me. And I think, a little bit into reading that book and all of the unraveling I was doing about my own privilege and power really just made it intolerable for me to stay at the company. So in 2016, I was just like, I gotta go. I've had enough. Oh, and another thing that was interesting, there's a woman named Lynn Twist who wrote a book called The Soul of Money. And one of the ideas in that book is that we're so fixated on abundance and more. And what about enough? What about enough?
Sure.
What about enough? And I just thought, enough. I'm allowed to say this is enough. And yes, people who are money focused can say, Mercer, you're an idiot because you're leaving all this money on the table, but I can declare this is enough already. So anyway, that's a little bit of my trajectory.
Whew, that's so powerful. Thank you for sharing that. You're fortunate enough to be in a position where you can say it's enough and walk away.
Yes.
But even with that being said, I think that it's a powerful example because, capitalism requires of us and demands of us and influences us. And all the messaging says, like you say, to keep going for more, there's never enough. I remember when I was in corporate spaces for a very little bit of time in my early 20s, that was one of the things that frustrated me when I was in sales positions. It was like, if you had a great month, good, but there's more. Like, what's
Yes.
next? It was never enough. And I used to get frustrated. Like, we just had a great month. I just did the damn thing, but now you're pushing me to do more. And it's just like, it's never enough. I'm like, how can that be sustainable?
And
So
it's not. It's not.
in so many ways. It's not in so many ways. So thank you for sharing, and thank you for setting that powerful example, because I'm sure there's people out there that may be listening that are in a position where they have the resources to, center themselves in ways that you've chosen to do, and your mental and, your mental, emotional, physical well-being, by getting out of a space that was no longer aligned with the person who you were becoming. So I think that's a very powerful example, especially someone that was at your, position of power, influence, and wealth status, and who stood to gain even more. So thank you for sharing that. So another thing I would like to get into along the lines of your personal journey is that you shared a little bit about your descriptors, and you said 3 descriptors that I know that as someone navigating corporate spaces, it wasn't the standard, it wasn't the norm. These are ways that you were different. So you're a woman, you said gay, and fat. And if I missed any descriptors that you feel like, again, aren't the norm, I can't think of the word I'm trying to think about right now, but it would say in corporate spaces, these are minority distinctions, or disadvantaged groups, or something, I can't, unfortunately the wording is leaving me, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
I want to know, were you able to show up as your full self when you were in your leadership role? Were you able to show up as your full self, or did you have to wear a mask?
Oh, such a good question. Oof. Such a good question. Woman and gay, those 2 identities, I feel like we're able to show up to a large extent. I think that there was some unconscious misogyny, is maybe too strong, but sexism. I was the only woman on the executive team almost the entire time that I was there. And so there were, comments and sort of vibes and stuff that I navigated because I was a woman. I remember one thing that, this is just a silly little thing, but I know that I never would stand up and clear the table when we would have a bunch of crap on the table because we had all just eaten. Like, I was just not going to take the role of, oh, you're the woman here, so you'll do that. I rarely took notes on behalf of the whole group. Like, I was really trying to not fall into the trap. Mm-hmm. But I think that, I have a certain level of confidence that I've always had, mm-hmm. That I think allowed me to sort of navigate being a woman in, a man's world, or that was, I think it made it a bit easier. I was really willing to go toe to toe with anybody in the group. Fat is a whole other conversation. I, started dieting when I was 11. The entire time I was in corporate, I was either on a diet or had just finished a diet. I was up and down weight-wise the entire time I was there. And I felt as though, looking back, I think it's sort of a ticket in to corporate respect that you not be heavy. And it was so fascinating. One of the sales processes that we did, when we got a whole bunch of different investment groups that would come in, and I don't know, I think we had 11 different groups or something, and they had anywhere from 5 to 15 people. It was almost all men, almost all white, a couple of exceptions. There were like a couple of Asian women, but like a couple out of like 100, and all skinny. It was fascinating. This is like the Wall Street persona. So when I left corporate, I started to get into the concept of no more diets. What is my body actually? How do I release the sort of grip of, deprivation and then, overindulgence. And I just, started doing all sorts of different work to free myself from the insanity of having spent my entire life trying to shrink my body or keep it shrunk. So I'm, I can't say I'm completely comfortable in my body right now. Like the overarching culture of thin is better is so insidious. I mean, and it's killing all of us because, skinny people will go to the doctor and they'll say, well, you're thin, you're fine. And then they'll drop dead, and fat people go to the doctor and say, something's wrong with me. And they say, no, nothing's wrong with you. You're just fat. And then they find out they have stage 3 cancer. So there's this bias that's so insidious, and is, racially, its origins are in racism. That's a tough one. So I think that's the first time I've ever introduced myself on this podcast. Is the first time I think I've ever used that word, just sort of said it like, here's part of who I am. Yeah. But I'm really trying to claim it and normalize that my body, it is what it is. And I don't have craziness around food at this point. If I want something, I eat it, but I'm not like, oh my God, if I could ever have whatever, that would be so great. Food has gotten much more neutral for me over the last, 5 or 6 years. Sure. So that's the one that I would say I wasn't able to show up completely as. I always had to be either trying to get thinner or thinner. It was just, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's, again, I know that's going to be valuable for our listeners. And as I'm listening to you, I'm processing just, we, as you see in our podcast description, we're a liberation project. And, I just hear so many themes of you liberating yourself, yes. And you being on like a liberation journey throughout the entire process. And you've been, liberated from corporate since 2016. You decide to walk away, retire early, relatively early compared to, conventional retirement age. And, and through even that decision was, a liberating decision for you. And I imagine, would you say that it's a fair statement to say like everything that you do to liberate yourself empowers you to make the next decision to liberate yourself? Like every decision you make along the way, and these awakenings, as we evolve, it kind of empowers us to do the next thing. Yeah. So hearing you say that you were willing to add, fat to your description of who you are, I can imagine how liberating that is. And also I can also appreciate the journey that it took you to get there. So I'm just kind of sitting in that right now and, reflecting as, I can relate, going on my own liberation journey and making so many decisions and getting pushback all along the way. Can you speak to that a little bit, just in your journey? I don't know when you came out as gay, but is in your journey and the different layers of liberation that you stepped into, did you encounter pushback or resistance from the people who love you? Or even
the coming out was really hard for me too. Interestingly, because I think of myself as having had a supportive family in that domain, but if you're gay, early on that you're attracted to the same sex. I mean, you just are. But I came out once when I was about 19. And when I called my mom and told her I was gay, she said, that's disgusting. I think she regretted that for a long time and, befriended one of her best friend's daughters who was also gay. And, really tried to help her heal her relationship with her mom. I think that was all sort of on behalf of the two of us. But I think the societal push to be straight, it was really internalized for me. I tried for a long time to have a boyfriend, get married, I, used the landmark education programs, which are, all about sort of declaring who you are. And I was like, I declare I'm straight. Like, I felt like if I could, just say it loud and proud enough, it would be true. And finally, when I was 30, I finally just said to myself, Merce, what if you really don't have a choice? This is not something you can, just force yourself into. What if you always were gay, you are gay, and you always will be? And once I considered that, everything changed. Like, there was just no question. And, but it was a hard process. And I think it was internalized a lot. It wasn't that a whole bunch of people were saying, oh, you're going to go to hell, or you should go to conversion therapy. I didn't have a lot of that, or any of that. But internally, I wanted to, meet that sort of, vision of, white picket fence, couple kids, a husband. Oh. Yes, normal. There you go. Yeah. I wanted to meet that vision of normal really, really badly. And I think this fat journey, I'm a little new with it. I think, and I follow a lot of people on social media who are fat advocates and, talking about HAES, health at every size, recognizing that we can be, moving our bodies, doing yoga, being healthy, but not necessarily with the goal of making our bodies smaller. And there is so much pushback on social media to, people who are just saying, I'm allowed to live in the body that I have. I mean, you see it with Lizzo. Lizzo is being so, loud and fat and proud, and people are just attacking her right and left. I don't think Adele was trying to be, sort of fat phobic by losing weight, but people used her weight loss to, kind of validate, like, anything, we all want to do anything we can to be smaller. So it's a tough one. It's a really tough one. And my brother has always been very, let's see, what is the right word? He loves skinniness. I remember when I was, 110 pounds, I had lost my period because I was, just not really eating enough. And he was like, you still could lose a few more pounds. Oh. And I have not had the conversation with him about fat phobia and being liberated by being fat. I mean, he obviously, sees my body and knows that I'm not, skinny at this point, but it's a really tough one. Yeah. Internally, and it feels like externally. It feels like people are a little skittish, like, well, what about diabetes and what about this? And truth be told, most of the research where the common wisdom is that if you're fat, you're less healthy, most of that research has been debunked. But even doctors don't know that. They're pretty sure if you could just get a few pounds off, you'd be healthier. Yeah. And it's mostly just not true. So yeah, so that's a tough one. Gay was easier in the end once I took it on, but this one I've taken on, and it still feels hard.
I'm glad you spent some time touching on that, because we actually intend on doing a show on fat phobia, where we'll go a little bit deeper into that. So
wow.
So thank you for touching on that. So let's transition back to, our theme, our current theme for the podcast, which is corporate culture. Yeah. And I want to know, based on your experiences in corporate, how would you describe the state of corporate culture as it relates to equity, inclusion, and belonging right now?
Such a good question. I think we're really far from equity in terms of what it really means. I think we think everybody being treated the same equals equity. And I think when you start to really get into equity, it's not about that. It's really about recognizing that we're not all the same, and that, that part of equity is, sort of leveling the playing field, if you will. And I think, capitalist white America thinks leveling the playing field is everybody gets treated the same, and that's not true. So I think we're far from equity. In terms of inclusion, I think that, I think there's a huge spectrum of where people are at with inclusion, anti-racism, especially since the murder of George Floyd. There was, I think, a lot less conversation. I mean, I know a lot of DEI, consultants who are, all of a sudden completely busy, and they just weren't before the murder of George Floyd. But I think there's a huge spectrum of how people think of inclusion. So I think there are companies and executives that think of inclusion as the same as diversity, right? Like, as long as our stats look good, we have some women, we have some Black folks, we have some Asian folks, we have some Latinx folks, we have some gay folks, just fill in the check marks. And if we have a few of everything, then we're probably, good, some version of that. And we do need to have that because there are optics, and we don't want to be accused of blah, 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 but it's all, sort of optics, PR, check the box kind of thing. And then I think there are groups that recognize that diversity without inclusion and without doing work to make it actually feel good to these diverse people that you're bringing in, it doesn't really make any sense, and it doesn't make a positive difference. And it's, really perpetuating framework that just makes people feel sort of awful. And so those people, I think, are really trying to figure out, how do we shift ourselves? How do we not be the organization that's trying to make everybody appear like a cisgendered white male? How do we be more inclusive of the ways that people express themselves and the ways that people think, and neurodivergent thinking, and I think there's some of that work going on, trying to hear different voices about how it actually does feel. There is a pitfall to all that, though, because when I was doing, corporate sessions and leadership sessions, I think 3 different times there was one Black woman in the room, and she had been tasked with a bunch of anti-racism, inclusive, diversity work without extra pay, without any training. And meanwhile, she's trying to have a career, which is not about inclusive, leadership and diversity. It's about whatever her career path is. And she's already traumatized by this crazy society we live in. So, there are blind spots where people are like, oh, this will be great, we'll just ask the Black woman to take it on. And it's like, no, that's not the answer. That's got so many problems with it. So yeah, and I feel like there's a huge wake-up call coming. I mean, we're all watching Starbucks unionizing, we're watching Amazon unionizing, Apple starting to unionize. I feel like there's a huge wake-up call to sort of the ruling class, the oligarchs of America, if you will, because workers are uniting and recognizing that people have the power. And I do think letting go of the power and the hierarchy and the sort of trickle up to the top financial model, I'm hoping is going to start to have some challenges over the next few years.
Okay, awesome. I appreciate that perspective. What do you think about the idea? Well, let me frame it this way. One of the things that I've noticed is that you have social issues that are happening in communities that are sparking a certain level of outrage that is influencing the level of focus and attention that has now been put on equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts. You mentioned the murder of George Floyd in 2020 as, increasing opportunities for DEI consultants, et cetera. What do you think about that? Do you think that corporate America should play such a large role in this cultural shift or this demand for change? Is that corporate America's role? Should they play as large a role? How do you feel about it? That's like, it feels to me as like the main battleground for the cultural shift that people are demanding and seeking. It's like, we're going to hold these corporations accountable. So it's something I've noticed. I want to know if you've noticed that too, and just, do you have any thoughts about it?
Such a good question. I think I've become more and more wary of power institutions, the government, large corporations, being us thinking about them as the catalyst for change. And I think, sort of a la Adrienne Maree Brown's work, where she talks in the beginning of Emergent Strategy about how we can take any lessons we want to from nature. We can sort of go survival of the fittest and, overlay that onto human beings, or we can look at mycelium and fungi and dandelions and tree roots and that kind of collaborative, connective, really much more sustainable way of living than, a lot of these survival of the fittest mammals. And I sort of have this visual in my head of community building and connection being the way out, if you will. And I think the community building and the connection then forces change onto corporations, governments. But I don't think that we can rely on corporate power structures or governments to make that change. I think it's much more grassroots, deeper connecting in ways that, can be challenging, across racial lines, across socioeconomic lines, across gender lines, across sexual preference lines. Like, if we can really be getting better at increasing our capabilities to self-organize and connect as human beings, I think we have a chance. And then it will sort of trickle up, and things will become no longer tolerable, to the government or to corporations. But I don't think those places are what are going to make the change. I think it's us.
So powerful. It resonates deeply. I spend a lot of time thinking about how I can be a part of that grassroots organizing in communities, in addition to the work that we do as a organization of Grow Dialogue. And as you know, I've done both. I organize in both ways, in both spaces. I do work in corporate spaces as well as in grassroots, on the ground. And I'm always thinking how I can do more. So I appreciate you saying that, because I get the same sense. And I feel like it's going to take, I guess, just continued effort, for people who have this lens and this awareness that you speak of, to not just think that these powerful corporate structures are going to save the day. They're going to save us, and more people, feeling empowered to understand that we can save ourselves. We can organize across those differences in identity, in culture, et cetera, and find spaces and places in our communities that can bring us together versus the very segregated silos that our country tends to operate in, and I guess most places in the world do. I want to say one thing about that too, Sundiata. I feel like this is important to say, which is that in my experience, one of the most difficult divides to connect across is socioeconomic. And I think that we think it's racist, or racism or racial divides, but I think that, I know plenty of white people who are like, well, I have my rich Black friend who I go play golf with, and that's not hard. You're in a socioeconomic stratosphere where you two can relate to each other. I think that it's challenging to be someone who has a lot materially
and be really interconnected with somebody who doesn't, and vice versa. And yet there's so much beauty in those connections. I mean, I've really been working over the past 5 years to strengthen my relationship with people across all walks of life. And it's amazing what happens if you can move through the discomfort of what society has set up. Society has set up haves and have-nots, and has made it very difficult for us to relate to each other. And I just, offer to the listeners and stuff that if you can try to break down that divide in your own way, in your own life, it's enriching, and it's hard. It's hard. So anyway, I just want to put that out there, because I think it's really big in this moment of workers uniting and people taking back power. If we can bridge that connective divide, on our own micro levels, I think that ripples out, like Adrienne Maree Brown would say, like fractals.
Indeed. And as you know, and for our listeners, Adrienne Maree Brown's work is very influential on me as well. Emergent Strategy was definitely one of the most influential books on my journey, as an anti-oppression organizer, content creator, and facilitator. And so I appreciate you bringing her work to the forefront. Yeah. This has been very rich, Merce. There's so many ways and places we can go, and you got the brain going, and I love it. I love every time we get a chance to talk in this way, and I'm glad we got a chance to do it, because we've done this, in different settings, but I'm glad that we get a chance to do it in this setting for the listeners to kind of, get some insights into your journey, because it's been a phenomenal, I guess not phenomenal, it's not the word I'm looking for. It's been a very rich, interesting, expansive, story of evolution and liberation. I'm just so grateful you had a chance to share it with our listeners. I want to close out with one question that we ask all of our guests. And the question is, can you share a story that has inspired you and or your work?
What popped to mind when you asked that question is our mutual friend, Akilah S. Richards. And there was a moment in time on my journey of recognizing that self-directed education was where my son needed to be, and really thinking about the ways that we try to corral human beings into a certain formula in school. And I just had this epiphany that self-directed education was access to liberation for Black and Brown folks. I was like, oh my God, there is no liberation in this, one size fits all, sit down, shut up, learn what I want you to, when I want you to, and, when the bell rings, learn something else, kind of education. And then it was soon after I had that epiphany that our mutual friend Thomas, told me about Akilah and how her platform was that whole conversation. And I was like, oh my God, my head exploded. And so getting to meet Akilah and, being part of her journey of getting her book written and published, Raising Free People, I think just the whole, it makes me emotional, really connecting with Akilah directly and with Black and Brown parents who have found a way for their children to be who they are and not be, shoved into this white man's education system has, it's changed everything for me. It's really changed everything for me to be part of that. I don't even know what to call it, but just part of that movement. Huh?
Yeah, that story.
Yes.
Yeah, that story, that movement. But indeed, that's a powerful story. And, for our listeners, just so you all know, you will for sure be hearing from Miss Akilah S. Richards as a guest on our show at some point in the near future. So thank you so much, Mercer. This has been such a rich, discussion, conversation, and thank you for, being so vulnerable and transparent in all that you shared. I take so much from every time we get a chance to be together. It inspires me And I'm hoping that our listeners, and assuming that a lot of our listeners will feel the same way after hearing all that you shared in your journey. And I'm sure a lot of folks will be able to relate to a lot of the elements of what you shared. So with that being said, before we go, is there a way that anyone who wants to follow you, to hear more from you, can potentially do that?
Yeah. So one thing before I say that, and just to say thank you so much, Sundiata, being part of your journey. I mean, even from before you claimed Sundiata as your name, and you're practicing what you preach in so many different ways, as a parent, as an educator, as somebody doing work in corporate spaces, as a human being, as a romance partner. I just have so much love and connection with you, and I look forward to how our paths continue to cross. So I am on Twitter. Sometimes I'm super active. For a few years, I haven't been super active, but I plan to again. I think it's a good platform for me. So if you want to follow me on there, and if folks do start following me, it might be more impetus for me to start getting my voice out more. And my handle is @MerlinWorks, MERLINWORKS.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we'll be sure to include that in the show notes for all of our listeners, so you can follow Merce and inspire her to share more of her just wonderfully diverse, experiences and journey, and continue to learn. So once again, I appreciate all of you for being here and listening to another episode of the Grow Dialogue podcast. And until next time, I love y'all.
I love y'all too.
Thanks for tuning in to the Grow Dialogue podcast. Remember to join our Grow Dialogue community to continue the conversation, activate authentic dialogue, and to get exclusive content, discounts, and special offers on curated artwork and music from independent artists from the Americas. Check out our show notes for more info and visit www.growdialogue.com to join our live events. Don't forget to support us on Patreon. We really appreciate your support.